When you think about German tanks of the Second World War, certain ones come to mind. The Panther or Tiger, for example, both extremely famous tanks. However, when I think about German tanks, I tend to think about the Panzer IV and all the various variants that were produced throughout the Second World War. Interestingly enough, not only was it the most produced German tank of the war, but it was also the most exported tank as well. The Panzer IV was delivered to several German allies, including Bulgaria, Finland, Romania, and although not involved, Spain as well. Other nations used them as well, including France and the Soviet Union. But interestingly enough, the Panzer IV fought well into the 1960s in the Syrian army. In today's video, we're going to cover those tanks. Following their independence in April of 1946, the new Syrian state was in need of new military equipment, particularly armored vehicles, as it was a tumultuous time in the Middle East. One such vehicle they were to receive in the coming years was the Panzer IV, from France of all nations. As you see, the French had been operating Panzer IVs along with other German vehicles and vehicles from Allied nations as a stopgap until domestic production of French-built tanks and other vehicles could be produced. Yet, the French had little interest in the German tanks following the Second World War and were happy to part with them. The tanks were likely sitting in French military warehouses since late 1945. The dates of the transactions are a little hazy, however, the first transfer of tanks probably occurred between 1950 and 1951. After the 1948 Israeli War of Independence, France tried to remain cordial with both sides and, in an attempt to do so, armed both sides. As the Panzer IVs were no use to the French, they were happy to sell them to the Syrians. The amount of vehicles delivered is suspect as well, as some sources say as little as 11 were delivered, while others say as many as 40. What is known is that all of the Panzer IVs were the 75mm long barrel version of the Panzer IV. However, the variants, again, were suspect, with the most likely being the J variant. There are reports that Frankenstein tanks with the variant J hull, suspension, and propulsion were mated with an older D turret with the long barrel version KWK-40 placed in it. Regardless of what they were, the Syrians received some Panzer IVs from France. Another source of ex-German equipment was Czechoslovakia, as following the collapse of Germany in 1945, the Soviets established a staging area for surrendered German vehicles, particularly tanks, north of Prague. Over the coming years, the Czechoslovak government collected more tanks from the various battlefields of the war and continued to repair them and stage these vehicles for use or for prospective buyers. By January 1947, the Czechs had an estimated total of 245 Panzer IVs operational, a genuinely impressive number. There was a smattering of different variants, D, G, H, and J variants being the most prominent. But, of course, with the nature of these vehicles, there were a lot of Frankenstein versions as well, as they were cobbled together from the various tanks found within the nation. Regardless, the tank proved to be a very useful addition to the Czechoslovakian army, as they were not ready to produce domestic tanks quite yet, or had not received enough T-34s from the Soviets to fulfill the army's needs. They did basic maintenance on the tanks to keep them in working condition, operating in the Czech army until around 1954. In April of 1955, a Syrian military delegation visited Prague looking to purchase ex-German military equipment. An agreement was struck for the vehicles. Amongst the vehicles were 45 Panzer IVs. Despite the tanks being obsolete and not even being used by the Czechoslovakian army anymore, they wanted a fair price for them, with the cost reportedly being around £4,500 for each vehicle, around £102,000 in 2025 money, or $136,000, a steep price. Nevertheless, the Syrians purchased the Panzer IVs along with other ex-German vehicles. The tanks were delivered to Syria by November of 1955. By this point, the Syrians were having difficulties with the tanks they purchased from the French, and by 1958, they purchased another 15 from Czechoslovakia, these being non-operational for use as hauls for spare parts. Included in this order were 16 refurbished engines for the tanks. The Syrians did receive a mixed bag from the Czechoslovakian purchase, with plenty of Frankenstein tanks, many having their bow machine guns removed, and in some cases, their coaxial gun as well. Some of these tanks also had Schutzen spaced armor turret kits, very interesting to see it in Syrian service. There were other changes as well, like the adoption of the Soviet DSHK 12.7mm machine gun and an anti-aircraft crescent mount originally made for the T-34 being fitted to the initial 45 tanks they purchased, with additional kits for the tanks they sourced from other nations like France and another nation we haven't discussed. Taking from Panzer IV, the workhorse of the Panzerwaffe by Bob Carruthers, in the 1960s, Syria received several Panzer IVs from the French, replacing the turret's machine gun with a Soviet-made 12.7mm 0.5-inch machine gun. These were used to shell Israeli settlements below the Golan Heights and were fired upon during the 1965 water war by Israeli Centurion tanks. Syria received 17 more Panzer IVs from Spain, which saw combat during the Six-Day War in 1967. So the Syrians also received tanks from Spain. As with all of these numbers, it's difficult to track down the actual number. However, 17 seems to be the most commonly reported. These 17 tanks were part of an order the Spanish had placed in 1943 for 20 tanks. These two were the 75mm long barrel version, likely being the H variant. When the Syrians received them, they were in the original condition as the Germans had equipped them in the Second World War. All of them were delivered by 1965 and were in excellent condition, never having seen combat, being the best Panzer IVs the Syrians operated. Now that we've covered all the sources for the Syrian tanks, we should cover how they modified them, as there were changes, as I previously had mentioned. The most notable changes were the lack of coaxial and bow machine guns, as a vast majority had none, with some of them having their original German weapons, some Soviet, with the report of a Soviet 50 cal coaxial machine gun, a difficult thing to do, but it isn't out of the realm of possibility. A good portion of the Syrian Panzer IVs had that crescent-shaped AA mount over the commander's cupola, a very interesting looking piece of equipment. Before we discuss how they performed in combat, I do want to mention again, the Syrians did operate other armored vehicles, notably T-34s, Stug 3s, Jagdpanzer IVs, and other German vehicles, so they did have quite the interesting combination of eclectic vehicles to use, as well as more modern tanks like the Soviet-built T-54/55. Although most of the Syrian Panzer IVs were in working condition, they were all 20+ years old and starting to show their age, with some of them having to be driven at 10 miles an hour or below to maintain them. However, one way the Syrians did use the tanks was to emplace them on the western slopes of the Golan Heights, almost directly on the border with Israel, to fire down on Israeli irrigation workers and farmers in the Galilee region. The Panzer IV of all vehicles was chosen for this task. Most likely, the Syrians felt that these tanks were the most expendable tanks in their inventory, as Israeli counterfire was expected. The Panzers were dug in and not easy to shoot back at, due to their altitude advantage. Throughout the coming years, Israeli tanks, including M4 Shermans, fired on the Syrian Panzers, as well as the Cold War-era Centurion tank, which, it's safe to say, the Centurion outclassed the Panzer IV with its high-velocity 105mm gun. In 1965, 2 Syrian tanks were destroyed, and others were abandoned by their crews on the Golan Heights due to the aforementioned Israeli gunfire in what is described as the Water War. Where things start to get interesting is in the Six-Day War, with Syria's participation being hampered by the lack of organization with the other nations involved in the conflict and within the Syrian military itself. On the evening of June 5, 1967, Syrian generals in Damascus pushed the government to exploit the unfolding situation by launching an immediate invasion of Israel. Planning and preparations were rushed, taking place in just a few hours after midnight. By early morning on June 6th, Syrian commanders awoke to find that they had been ordered to begin the invasion. 3 infantry brigades stationed on the Golan Heights, supported by various independent battalions, were designated to lead the attack, while the rest of the Syrian military mobilized. However, there was no coordination. Individual battalions advanced as soon as they were ready, without waiting for others. Some brigades moved out, missing key subunits that had fallen behind. In one instance, a platoon attempting a flank move to the south tried to cross the Jordan River at the wrong location and was swept away. According to the KGB, at least one Syrian unit showed cowardice and refused to carry out its orders altogether. On June 9th, Israeli forces launched their assault into the Golan Heights, taking a route that the Syrians had least anticipated, an arc that closely followed the Lebanese border. This was the first time Israeli troops encountered Syria's armored units, which had previously been held back due to concerns they were too slow and vulnerable for offensive use. The following day, June 10, 1967, turned into a complete rout. Syrian forces were struck from behind by IDF units swinging south from their initial advance, while a second Israeli wave attacked from the west. In just 15 hours, Syria was estimated to have lost between 20 and 25% of its total military vehicle stock. A ceasefire was declared at midnight, bringing an end to Syria's failed campaign. In this failed campaign, Syrian panzers were likely used along with other German vehicles. Syria had an estimated 25 fully operational Panzer IVs on June 6, 1967, with around 10 others partially operational or at least functional enough to take into combat, mostly using the Czechoslovakian and Spanish ones. Including the pair of destroyed panzers in the water war, IDF tanks and aircraft destroyed at least 10 Panzer IVs during the Six-Day War. The last one destroyed was by an Israeli M50 Super Sherman. Like the Centurion, the Super Sherman completely outclassed the Panzer IV. Interestingly enough, 4 were captured intact by the Israelis and taken as trophies. As old as they were of no use to them and were sent straight to museums as exhibits. Another 2 were knocked out, but stable enough to move back to Israel to use in weapons testing. Following the war, and a loss of a majority of the operational Panzer IV force, and with them not having destroyed a single Israeli tank as far as it's known, the elderly tanks were taken out of service. Although impressive, they were still running and in operational condition by 1967. It can be considered a mistake to pit them against Cold War-era tanks. Regardless of the outcome of these tanks, I find it an incredibly fascinating subject to discuss and an excellent first topic for this new second channel. Hopefully, as many of you can tell, this is important naval history. I had the desire to discuss other subjects and didn't find it appropriate to do so on the main channel. Anyway, thank you for watching, and please remember to like and subscribe, as it'll help the channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have a great day.